couple people in the room that know me and know that it's really hard for me not to talk a long time about something that is a really amazing topic, which is the diversity of our state. So I have these slides, and I'm going to do my best to not go on and on. But if you see something or you hear something that doesn't sound right, I don't mind you interrupting the flow and just saying, hey, what was that? I don't get that. I don't mind at all. So hopefully I'll be clear enough for you all, but you know, if there's something that's not quite there, please. Carmen asked me about some references for you guys. So one I'm going to say to you is a really good reference is The Plant Life of Kentucky. And even if you're not a botanist, most of this book is plant keys, how to identify the things you're looking at. The front of this book, Ron Jones did us a big favor in writing extensively about why is the plant life where it is. So this is a really good book as a reference for you to kind of follow up on some of the things I'm talking about. Now the nomenclature that I'm going to use has to do with this map that if you would just pass this around to everyone. It's a little different than what Ron has in his book, but this is the latest and greatest iteration by the Nature Preserves Commission, and since I worked there all that time, I'm kind of biased about the quality of the information. So I think this is really about the best you can do right now until the botanists and the ecologists get together and do something else with it. Another book that is worth your time, and shame on you if you don't already own it, Kentucky's Natural Heritage, which was written by my colleagues and a host of the rest of us that chimed in here and there. This is a wonderful book. It has really great maps and illustrations and beautiful photographs of the state's biodiversity, and it's where a lot of the information that you're going to see in this talk is also provided. So this is another book that you can, it's been out for some time now. You probably can find it on Amazon fairly cheaply. It came out at $40 book, and I don't think it stayed there very long. But it's a really, really valuable book for anyone who wants to know about the natural history of our state, and it's just top-notch. So those are a couple of references. There's some other information that's out there, and I know that you all are very inventive and curious, so you can just start typing that information in your browser and find something as well. So as I said, I was one of those privileged people who got to do this as a job. So it's really hard to stop talking about it, but we'll get started talking about it right now. The objectives for this class session and for the chapter that I wrote is for you to be able to identify Kentucky's 3 physiographic provinces and 9 natural regions, for you to be able to explain differences between those natural regions, explain the key factors that influence the ecological diversity in Kentucky, and recognize characteristic species and natural communities of each region. Now, it's not like you have to have some comprehensive ability to do this. I'm going to give you a few examples. My hope is that as you travel the state, you'll investigate this further. And, one thing to realize right away is that we have been blessed in this state with a rich diversity of plants and animals and insects, and this is just a picture to just kind of get you all excited about the variety and diversity that's out there, and also just it's a beautiful photograph. But we are lucky. And why is that? What's going on in Kentucky that's making us that way? Well, let me get the button going right. That's because of where we sit in the nation and these physiographic provinces. There are 3 provinces, the Appalachian Highlands, interior low plateaus, and the Gulf Coastal Plain that go through Kentucky. And the Gulf Coastal Plain, if you'll note, wraps all the way around. And that's kind of an interesting thing when you consider what is known about the Gulf Coast and states to our south as far as the diversity of species that are found there. The other thing to realize, this is also sometimes called the Mississippi embayment. It's also just the Gulf of Mexico used to be up here. And if you can think about that, that's kind of an interesting thing. You know, you kind of have to wrap your mind around it. And when you get to the geology section, I'm sure you'll really get your minds wrapped around it. But it's just fascinating to think about the fact that the coastal plain reaches all the way up here just because of past influences. And as you can see too, the Appalachian Highlands reach up further. The interior low plateaus go into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. So there's a lot of pathways, a lot of ways for diversity to be successful here in Kentucky. So here are those natural regions, and you all have the map now. So our 3 provinces, the coastal plain is just this little chunk. The the interior low plateaus run here, and then here is the Appalachian Highlands. And then those are further divided into the Mississippi and Ohio River floodplain, which is this yellow, and here is the East Gulf coastal plain. And what's interesting is the boundary between the East Gulf coastal plain and the interior low plateaus is the ancient coastline of the Gulf. And that is on the landscape that can be observed if you know what you're looking for. So that's, again, pretty cool. So within the interior low plateaus, you have the Shawnee Hills, the Highland Rim, the Knobs, and the Bluegrass region. The Appalachian Highlands are the Appalachian Plateaus, and this is the Cumberland Plateau and the Appalachian Plateau, or the Appalachian Plateau, and then the Cumberland Mountains, which includes Black Mountain, Brush Mountain, Pine Mountain, the Cumberland Mountains. That's all through there. So, oh, I'm sorry, this is originally called Allegheny Plateau. And if any of you have taken geology classes in the past, or geography classes, an even simpler map used to say Eastern Coalfield, Western Coalfield. If you've ever seen those maps, they've given it new names because we really don't want to identify by the mineral. We want to identify by the landscape features and species. Sorry if I offended any geology types in the room. But here's a geology picture just for you guys. The other thing to note when you're talking about the diversity is the substrate that all of these things are on. So in this part of the state, we have Pennsylvanian outcroppings. In here are Mississippian, Silurian, Devonian. The oldest rock in the state, Ordovician rock, is here. Mississippian here, Pennsylvanian, and all of this out here is much newer material. It's alluvium, it's from the Quaternary period, it's less than a couple million years old. And this map is also in that Natural Heritage book, so it's a good reference. But wherever you have these differences in the substrate, the bedrock, you're going to see breaks in vegetation, changes in vegetation types as you go from one end of the state to the other. Is there anyone in the room who hasn't really traveled from one end of Kentucky to the other? Okay, so you know how diverse and different. We've got mountains down here and wetlands out here. And so there's a lot of things that are going on in between there. So just think about it the next time you're driving out there. When you drive down the Bluegrass Parkway and all of a sudden you see the knobs rising up, now it makes a little more sense, a little more interesting drive for you. And maybe you could bore the people you're with and just start talking about, you know, all these things and make them turn up the music. But anyway, you will know a little more about it as you drive. What else adds to the diversity of our state? All of the karst. We've got these areas of limestone that the water from the rain seeps down through these layers, dissolves the rock, water washes through and erodes the rock. So you've got areas where you've got sinkholes, caves, springs, and each one of those localized springs, sinkhole areas, and caves, that adds to the diversity of what's on the landscape at these locations. So this map just kind of, again, is showing you what's going on out there. The other thing to note is that there's a big concentration here and here. And we look at another map. This is that Highland Rim. And this area was called the Big Barrens back in the time of European settlement. And does anybody know why it was called the Big Barrens, besides Peter? Who better remember? Okay, Peter, do you remember?
A few trees.
That's right. The people who, I'm going to give it to him because, he was a commissioner for our agency. People who traveled through Illinois were French. So they said these treeless plains were called prairies. But the people that came through Kentucky were English and Scotch, and they didn't have fancy words like prairie. So they said, hey, this doesn't grow trees. That soil must be barren. And so that name stuck. But what's interesting is that's pretty high quality agricultural land now. It was called the Barrens because there was no trees, and the reason there was no trees is that it was the big stronghold in our state for all the grasslands that we used to have before settlement stopped all the wildfires. The other thing to note about the Big Barrens is if you've got all this karst, that means you've got a lot of ways for the soil to be porous, the rocks to be porous, and for the water to get off of the surface. If you have no water running in streams along the surface except during high rain events and spring runoff, then a fire that runs through that grassland is not going to get stopped. So that's why these areas were so strong in being the places where a lot of these grassland communities were, and in now where they are limited to for the greatest part. So topography also has a role to play in the diversity of our landscapes. Highest points on Black Mountain. The lowest point in the state is 257 feet out there in Fulton County on the Mississippi River. And if you've ever been out that far, it is just flat. It is just like you feel the sky pushing you down into the earth. It is so flat out there. I have a fellow who works, well, I say that, a fellow who I worked with when I worked for the Nature Preserves Commission who was from the mountains. When I took him out there, he just felt so uneasy. And I said, what's wrong with you? And he goes, I need my hills around me. And he just felt so unsure just being out there in that big flat open. And I have a few pictures that'll demonstrate that, and then you can understand perhaps a little better. Rainfall amounts vary through the state. That has an effect. That includes snowfall precipitation on top of Black Mountain. You can be down there and there's no snow where you are, but you can look up at the top of Black Mountain and it's white. So that also has a role to play in the diversity that we see. Temperatures as well. Down on the mountain, the average is 50 to 52. Out here, you can see 58 and above. So if you're sitting in Lexington thinking you're cold, well, maybe now this map will help you figure out another place to go be. So, those are the big picture items with regards to these provinces and these natural regions. I'm also going to talk tonight a little bit about natural communities, because that's what I took care of. There are over 60 natural communities known from the state of Kentucky. And what is a natural community? It's a distinct group of plants and animals that can repeat across the landscape wherever the similar environmental conditions are met that allow them to exist in those groupings. I show this picture of prescribed burning because in some instances we have to assist with some of the environmental conditions. We have to provide that disturbance factor to enhance the ability of these natural communities to exist on the landscape. So that happens sometimes, where they can't be there all by themselves because their disturbance factor is no longer present. I could have put a picture of bison up there, and that would have been the same thing. Bison are a disturbance factor for a lot of landscapes. So what else shapes a natural community? Mention the geology. So are you on sandstone? Are you on siltstone? Are you on limestone, shale? That's going to have an effect as far as acidity, alkalinity of the soils, soil depth, pH, nutrient levels, drainage. Are these soils really mucky? Are they on the side of a hill that gets baked all day long and they're dry as a bone? There's really no nutrients in them. Hydrology. Are you sitting out in the Mississippi floodplain and you're constantly being flooded? Is there a long hydro period or a short hydro period where you, the plant, or you, the animal, is existing? And then your landscaped position, the aspect and slope. Are you on a south-facing slope where you get the sun all day long? Are you on a north-facing slope where it's cooler and moister and shadier? All those factors affect natural community types. This illustration is just marvelous because it really gives you a chance to talk about what I just said in a nice graphic way. Here's south, there's north. So south-facing, these hills here are south-facing. There's your prairies and your glades. If you're down in a sheltered valley where you don't really see the sun from any direction, it's going to be a little more moist. You're going to have hemlocks and other species like that down in there. Up on top of a ridge, dry soils, dry forest. Down into swamps and rivers, lacustrine systems, you're going to have more saturated soils and definitely different species occurring there. This illustrates bald cypress trees, for example. So this is a good way to really think about when you're out on the landscape. Am I on a north-facing slope? What am I going to expect to see here? Am I on a south-facing slope? What are the conditions that I'm going to run into here as far as just how much sun I'm going to find, and what kind of dryness will there be in soils? So those are kinds of things to be thinking about when you're out on the land and looking at the vegetation, and sometimes even the other species of salamanders. You're not going to find a salamander out on a glade, but you'll find what would be out here instead of a salamander that has a tail and skits around pretty fast. A lizard. You're going to, these species all adapt to what their environment is. So in addition to everything we just talked about with regards to substrate and soils and aspect and slope, you also have just these regional influences on what we see on our landscape that adds to the biodiversity of our state. The Appalachian Mountains have an influence here. The northern temperate forests as well. And our prairie species came from somewhere, and that was out in the Midwest. When the glaciers receded and it got really dry, the prairie moved into Kentucky. And we talked about the coastal plain and how that has been influenced because 70 million years ago, the water started to recede from the Gulf of Mexico. So, I'm about done showing you maps of Kentucky. I'm sure you're probably getting tired of that. But it's a good way to kind of show you the state because we can't go there. Although I would love to take you all across the state and show you things. This map shows Kentucky prior to European settlement. And the interesting thing to note here is all the blue, which are the wetlands, and the amazing unbroken patches of green, which are the forests. And look what happened. All the black is coal, and the red are the cities. Look at this big old red blob. It's no wonder they have so much problems with heat islands over here. Anyway, and look at the blue. The blue is just about gone except for where we have dammed up the rivers to make these artificial lakes. Coming from Ohio and Minnesota like I do, it was really weird to come here and have people going crazy over these lakes. And I said, it's just nothing but a dammed river. What have you done, you crazy people? But they're very excited about their big giant lakes. So I had to, I had to learn to shut up about that. But I come from a place where the glaciers gouge the lakes out, so I'm legit. Okay, now we're going to get a little in depth on those provinces and the community types. And this is a whirlwind, and I really, I know you don't want to sit here the whole time, but it's really hard to not show you lots and lots of pictures of things. But here we are, Mississippi and Ohio River floodplains is that first natural region in the Gulf coastal plain. So looking out here, here's the river. and you can see there's sand bars out here. This is an old oxbow lake. So what we're looking at in this entire region are the lowlands, poorly drained, nearly level. There's not going to be a lot of topography here. So the species that you're going to see sitting in these little sloughs and old oxbows. Does anybody know what an oxbow is? I say that like you know. Yes, sir.
Where the river channels out in the oxbow and then fills in and cuts across the throat of it and isolates it.
That's right, an isolated old channel of the river, and if you were ever to fly over the Mississippi River, and maybe some of you have been lucky enough to do so, you'll find all these old channels that no longer are connected anymore because the river keeps moving.
It kind of does that naturally, back and forth.
It does. It does, and it cuts itself off in some places. So what happens is these areas are still low and fill with water, and so you have a lot of species that are dependent upon those. So the other thing that's really important to think about when you're talking about rarity of species, some of these communities only exist in localized, special areas, just because you don't find oxbows of the river everywhere. So there might be fish species that are inhabiting these oxbow lakes that you're not going to find in a flowing stream or even out in the river anymore. So there's just ways of looking at these isolated community types as little treasure houses that have things that we don't see across the entire landscape. I mentioned before the ocean covered this part of the state as recently as 70 million years ago. This is a cypress tupelo swamp. So the dominant species here are the cypress trees and tupelo trees that are able to withstand a long, prolonged hydro period, which is flooding for a long period of time without harming the trees. Now they do need a drawdown period for young trees to germinate and grow. So it can't be soaking wet year after year after year, or you won't have any new trees occurring in those habitats. But again, flat, poorly drained, that's the norm for the Ohio River and Mississippi River floodplain natural region. And here is the East Gulf coastal plain habitat. And the pictures I have for this is a seep along the Blood River, which has rare species inherent with it, including this beautiful little azalea that is only known from that area in our state. It's known from other places, but in Kentucky it's pretty much in the Gulf coastal plain in these seeps. And then of course our good friend, the cottonmouth, and they like it out there. This is where the habitat starts to rise up. It's not as flat. There is more of a little bit of relief. You'll have low bluffs associated with this area, and that's where those cottonmouths go to hibernate in the winter. So when you're walking around in those bluffs in the fall, you'll see them going up to hang out in their dens. And in the spring, if you're still walking those bluffs, you'll see them coming out in big bunches to go back down into the swamp. So mind your feet when you're out there. It's a thrill, but it's also kind of like, whew. But luckily they aren't real fast moving or anything, so it's kind of like you see them before you step on them, I guess. Okay, so that was this area. Now, the interior low plateaus, which is this giant chunk of the state. It's a very different area from one end of it to the other, just because you've got the different substrates. You've got Mississippian limestones here. You've got big sandstones from the Pennsylvania period here. You've got these knobs here that are an erosion feature that we'll talk about. And then you've got these flatter, more rolling plains here of the bluegrass. So plateaus, bluffs, basins, and domes separated by distinct escarpments. Has anybody ever heard of Muldraw's Hill? Okay.
Louisville?
You'll hear about these things when you're doing your geology. And the Pottsville Escarpment. These are areas that define and delineate between these regions because of the geology. So you will come across those terms, I'm sure, when you get to your geology class. But it's vastly different from one end to the other with regards to the topography, which again leads to a very diverse plant and animal assemblage. I had to throw the Owensboro Lowlands Ohio River floodplain in here because it is a part of the interior low plateau, but it's basically a continuation of the Ohio River and Mississippi River floodplains in just the development of it. It's flat. It's a lot of times very hydric as far as the soils go. Hydric is defined here. Soils poorly drained, water table at or above the surface most of the time. You've got a lot of understory species are just forbs and sedges.